Hello juniors and welcome back to Computer Systems and Programming. For this video, we're going to be going over how to make data structures in Python. So, first thing we're going to do, as usual, is make a data structures project folder. So you go File, New, PyDev project, and then you can go ahead and name this data structures, just like that. I can't make one because I already have one done. Then once you do that, you can go ahead and do File, New, PyDev module, and you can name this one Object. So once you have this .py object, the first thing we have to do is make the actual object itself. So while talking about data structures, we're using objects to kind of understand them as a concept. So object is just one type of data structure like we talked about. There are many types of data structures. We'll just be focusing on objects. So for this tutorial, we'll be making a student object that can store name, ID, and grade for each student that we have. So let's start by making a student class. So class, student. And right now, all we did is just, it makes that class. And now we'll be tabbed in, kind of like an if statement or a loop. We'll be inside of that class making different things. So now in this class, we have to make the function that actually makes the object itself. So we're going to define init, and it's going to have the parameter of self, and then it's also going to have a name. And we can make that name equal none. Then in this first function, we're going to have self.name equals name, self.id equals, and we'll make a string variable with just 6 zeros. Whoops, and this is supposed to be self. And then the final one is self.grade equals 0. So to kind of explain what we did here, every time you make a student object, it's going to call this function. And this function is going to be what makes that object itself. We wanted to have one parameter, and that's so that whenever you make a student object, you have to put a name so that you can set up that name. Now in objects, you have these different types of variables. This is, there's these kind of variables that exist in the object itself, and then there's the variables that exist within each function. So you notice if I highlight this one, these other names don't highlight. But if I highlight this one, it highlights these two because it says that these two are the same variable. This self name is inside the self object. Have this name set up, and this will be a special name for just this one object. Same with the self.id and self.grade. So we made these three variables that are specific to the object itself. The only one that we're setting up is name, and so this allows the person, when they're creating the student object, to make this name at first. Then at the bottom you can just put return. Oops. Now when working with objects, everything you have to do, or for every variable that you make inside of the object, you have to make a set and get function for them. So set functions allow us to set the data for each of the different variables. Get functions allow us to access the data for each of the variables and see what we stored inside. So let's go ahead and do this. We'll start with name. So we'll say define get name. So we're making a function. You'll notice that for every function that we make, self is just automatically brought into it. That's what we want. We always want to bring self into it. So for getting the name, all we have to do is return self.name. because what we want is to return the name that we have in this student object. This will all kind of make more sense as we're making the objects later, or as we're using this object. But just know that when we want to get this, get the student's name, we can use this getName function. Alternatively, if we want to set the name, we can say define setName, and of course we're going to have self, but then we're going to have another name equals none variable or parameter. So now we'll set self name to name, same way we did it in the original initializing function, and then we'll return nothing because we don't want anything to be returned. So this is the set and get function for the name object, or for the name variable within our object. Now we're going to do the same for all the other variables that we have. So we have two other variables. We have the ID and the grade. So we'll do get ID, and we'll return self.id, and then we'll define a set ID, and we'll have to send in an ID variable, and we'll say self.id equals ID, and then return. Then we'll define a get grade function, and we'll do self.grade, we'll do return self.getGrade, and then finally define set grade, and we'll bring a parameter of the grade in as well, and then we'll do self.grade equals grade, and then return that as well. So now we have our complete object. This allows us to make a student object that it has a name, an ID, and a grade. Now let's use this object to do some things with it. Like, let's show you how to call all of these different functions. So in your data structures project, let's make a new PyDev module, and we'll call this main. I already have one named main, so I'm just going to add another n just so that I can make a new one. But you can name yours with just one n. Now, first thing we have to do is bring in our object that we just created. So we'll use what we know from the libraries lessons, and we'll import object, because we have that module named object. Oh, and also make sure to save, because we didn't save through all that. But we'll import that object. Now, how do we start accessing these objects? How do we start creating them in this main function, or in this main thing? So all we have to do is make a variable. This variable will store the object itself, and we'll call object.student. So we're calling the object, this object import, we're calling that, and then we're going to the class student, object.student, and then we have to send in the parameter of name. So let's just do your name, my name, whatever you want to do. So now we should have an object called this creates an object call stored inside of student 1. Basically, student 1 references to that object, and then that's basically all we need to know. So now we can set the ID of that student. So we can say student1.set, and you see all of these functions pop up, just like with random, all of our different functions pop up. So we can do set ID. What do we want the ID to be? We can just make it the first student the very first one. So 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 1. Then, just to check that we did this correctly, let's print student1 dot get ID. So now let's go ahead and run this program. Hit the drop down, run as, Python run. It'll print our student's ID because that's the ID that we just set it to. Notice we can't, that's just how we access the ID itself. We can't just do student1.id because that doesn't actually bring us the ID. We have to do get ID because we have to use that function, that get function that we made. So now let's go ahead and set the student's grade as well. So student1 dot set grade, and then we can make this 100 because I'm an ace student and I always get hundreds. And then we can do the same thing. We'll print student1 dot get grade. So if we run this again, it'll print my student ID and then the grade that I got, which we just set. Notice we can also change any of this information now, since we still have those set IDs. So we can say student1, let's say we want to change the name. We can do set name, and let's change our name to Patrice, one of our other programming instructors. And then let's print student1 dot get name. So now if we run this again, it'll print our ID, our grade, and our new name. If we print it up here, let's go back up here, print student1 dot get name, and we run this. First it'll print Michael, because up here my name is Michael, and then it'll print my ID and my grade. But then down here we change the name to Patrice, so when I re-get the name, it recognizes that the name is now Patrice. So just like you have, to kind of explain what we've done here, we've made this student object that stores all of this information. It stores our ID, our grade, and our name. And we access those three variables through our set and get functions. So every time we do this, we have to create this object first. We have to say student1 equals object. This is just because we're importing it through here. And we're saying in that object file, in this object file, access the student class and make a new one with using the parameter Michael, because when you make it, you have to have this parameter of name. So when you make it, you have to do this and put that name in there. If you don't put that name in there, let's run this without putting that name. It won't throw an error because we don't want the program to like crash every time a person forgets to do that. So we just have it set to none. So if there's any variables that you send through, or if there's any time that you ever send it through without a variable, it'll throw, it'll just put a default answer in, which is none. If we got rid of this none, boop, boop, and then save all of this and run it, it'll throw an error because I need to put a parameter in there. But as long as we have this equals none in here, it'll save us from throwing any errors just as a precautionary thing. So we have to make this object, and now since this object, once it's created, it's stored in here, and this is the only way we can access it is through this variable. So we always have to hit the variable and then say dot whatever function we want to do, because all these functions are available to whatever objects we make. Notice if I make a var equals 0 and I say var dot, it's going to have way different functions available because this is all the functions available to normal integer variables. Whereas we made this object, this type of variable, so now since we have it, we can access all these functions inside of it. And we can add more functions that do some sort of calculation or whatever. We could say like define, and we could just make like calc. And so we could convert self.grade. We could just, we could convert it to something else. So let's make a variable and let's convert it to percent or something. So we'll do an empty string plus grade, and we'll say dot, we'll turn it into a string. So we'll use this string function that Python has that we know about, and then we'll add a percent sign. So we're converting this grade to a string and then adding a percent, and then we'll just return x. Now let's save all of this, go back to main, and we can say print student1 dot, and we can do calc now, and it'll print whatever we return from this function. So if we go ahead and print it, it'll return 100%. So we can add a bunch of functions that can do specific things with our objects. Our object is a very simple object, so we don't need to add any of those. But as you see, we can do those to do the different things that we want it to do. Notice if you print just student1, just the object itself, when we run this, it prints object.student object at whatever this means. What this is telling us is actually the information about the object and technically where it is stored in this program itself. So this is telling us what module, what class, and then that it's an object. Python has these objects available to us to make. So it's telling us it's an object stored at this, wherever this is in the program. That means something to the computer. It doesn't mean anything to us. Additionally, all of these things you do not have to do in a separate module. I can go to the bottom of this module right here and just do like new student and make student. I can call the same class and make Michael. And this is right at you can see this is right underneath our student object. We can access it in the same module. Now if I print, I'm going to do this just to prove a point basically, student.print name. If we run this object module now, it'll print Michael because I made this new object down here. So you can, just like you can import libraries and access them in separate modules, you can, for objects that you make, you can access them within your own, within its object. Notice I don't have to put the object dot in front of this because I don't have to tell it to look into a different file. I don't need this because I already have, because the class is right above it. Finally, you can store all of these things in lists. So like if we make a list, if we say student list and just make an empty list, we can, or at these specific things, we can make an object dot student, Michael. That's the first thing. So object at the first index is 0. At the second index is Patrice. Or sorry, at the first index is Michael. At the second index is Patrice. At the third index we can put AJ. Now we can make a for loop for x in student list, print x dot, and look, it recognizes that x will be objects because Python is really smart. So we can say get name. Now this loop will go through. Whoops, I ran the other one. Remember, every time you go to a different module, you have to do this run as Python run. And then it prints our three objects. It prints the object in the first index, or in the 0th index, in the first index, and the second index. So this is normally how you'll do it. You'll do some sort of student list dot append, and then you can just add objects dot student, what's another name? Juan. So now we know that this is, if we print student list at index 3, because that's what index 1 is at, we can say dot get name and run it, and it'll print Juan. So there's a lot of different things you can do with objects. The main thing is understanding how you can make them, understanding that you need a get and a set function for all of these different variables that you make, because you need to be able to access them and change them. You need to understand that you can make the objects within the same module, or you can import the object and make it in a separate module. And you can treat these objects like any other variable. You can store them in lists. You can do whatever you want with them. All you have to know is just that you can do things with them and make them and adjust them. You can change their names, get their names, print them, whatever. But once you make them, you have to reference them to the variable. So if I want to reference Michael, I have to go student list at 0, and that will give me, this is my Michael object. So that's all you have. That's the gist of understanding objects in Python. Now what you can do is go onto the data structures part in release 5, and you can go to the drills. You'll be making your own objects and then accessing them a little bit. Just download the drills and it'll tell you what to do. And then you'll be debugging a drill, so there's an object already made, and what you have to do is fix all the problems. So there'll be syntax errors where you forgot a colon or something, and then there'll be logical errors where you tell the function to get name, but you don't have a name in the object. So just go through those debugs and find all the errors and then fix them so that the object works correctly. All right, juniors, I will see you later.